Elliot, you mentioned that there's some like kind of go-to calculations for how people are measuring, how they can find out what pints per day they need. Can you tell me a little bit more like what is wrong with that calculation that's kind of going around and which is the better way to approach it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of different methods that people use. One of them is, they're estimating it based on square footage. They're estimating it based on the plant count and how big the plants are. Unfortunately, none of these things really matter. What really matters is how much water through irrigation are you putting into that room every day? Because the plants will evapotranspirate approximately 97% of that water. That's really the main figure that you need to know is how much irrigation is going in, because almost all of that water needs to come back out.
Okay, so you just said almost. So what values actually reduce that?
Yeah, so a certain amount of the water, if you're doing typical commercial setup, you're doing drain to waste. So you're irrigating the plants top down, drain to waste, and you always want to over irrigate so that the irrigation volume that you're applying will actually drip out of the plant and you have an excess. And you typically want to do about 10, maybe 15% excess so that you can flush some of the accumulated salts and waste products of the plant out of the pot or out of the cube, and that goes directly to waste. So if you're irrigating with, let's say, 1,000 gallons a day and you're doing 10% drain to waste, then 100 gallons of that irrigation is going to go directly down the drain and out. And you don't have to pull that out of the air because it's removed through the plumbing.
And are there any other things that reduce that load?
Yeah, so the plants themselves will incorporate a small portion of that water into the sugars when they're doing photosynthesis and other molecules. So that can vary, but it's different in the daytime and the nighttime. It's different based on the growth cycle of the plant, the size of the plant. But in general, we estimate somewhere between 95 and 99% is evapotranspirated. So you can deduct, we use a figure here of 97%. So we can deduct another 3% from that irrigation input. So now you're taking off typically 10% for drain to waste, 3% for the plant metabolism. And then the next one would be your HVAC system. So your air conditioning system will actually remove some moisture as well. But I don't like to use that as a I don't like to input that into our calculations unless people are very confident of how much moisture their air conditioning system can remove, because it varies a lot. It depends on the efficiency of the air conditioning equipment. Actually, more efficient air conditioning will remove less moisture because it's more optimized to cool, and less efficient air conditioners will actually function a bit more like a dehumidifier. So because of these variables, I tend to leave that out unless a customer requests it and they know the exact value of their air conditioning system and how much that can remove.
So and to add on to that, are there any things that actually increase the amount of dehumidification that would be needed?
Absolutely. What we're talking about here is in a sealed room. And we all know that even though the rooms are intentionally sealed, there can be infiltration of outside air if it's not completely and properly sealed. That outside air is going to carry some amount of moisture in with it. So you really want to make sure your rooms are sealed, not just for the air conditioning and, potentially, hopefully, CO2 augmentation, but also to keep that humidity out. But regardless, every time you open that door, because you have to go into the grow room every day and tend to your ladies, right? So every time you open that door, you are allowing some moisture to ingress along, when the humans pass through. Ourselves as humans, we respirate, and when we exhale, like the plants, we also exhale moisture. These factors are minimal when compared to the fertigation and the irrigation that we apply. So we generally exclude them. If it's a decent sealed room, we can kind of ignore those. And what we do is we roll everything, all of those little factors, we roll it into just saying we need some extra capacity just in general to accommodate for those things. And in fact, one of the other things that we need that extra capacity for is because, and this is very important, the dehumidifiers are not always like the amount that they need to remove changes throughout the day. when the lights are on, right after the lights turn off, before the lights turn on in the morning. There are different needs. And so just saying pints per day isn't good enough, because when those lights turn off, they need to be able to pull out a lot really quickly. So if you sized it perfectly evenly throughout the day, it's going to take them way too long to get that moisture out of the air when the lights turn off.
Okay, so Elliot, why is there such a demand for increased dehumidification when the lights are turned off?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons actually. So first of all, when the lights turn off, the temperature of the room drops dramatically. So the ACs the air conditioning units will turn off at some point. The air conditioning units are providing some dehumidification, so you're losing that dehumidification. In addition, the temperature, and this is the main thing, the temperature of the room is going to drop, right? So, and that, because that's why the air conditioner turns on. That's why the air conditioner turns off, because the lights aren't generating heat, so the ACs don't need to run. The rooms get a lot colder at night. And as I was alluding to earlier, when I said, remember, warm air holds a lot of moisture, cold air does not. So as the room cools off, you will have the same amount of moisture in the air as far as like grams of water, but the air cannot hold that moisture. And so then that's why you need to get that moisture out as soon as possible before it drops below the dew point. And which means basically, if you drop below the dew point, it's gonna rain. There's gonna be moisture accumulating on all the surfaces. So it's very important to get that moisture out really quickly when the lights are off.
So Elliot, so how much extra capacity do we typically kind of calculate when we're trying to calculate the extra capacity needed when the lights go off?
Yeah, the standard in the industry is 25 to 30%, and that works well.
Are there any other ways that we can mitigate the increase in demand when the lights go off?
Absolutely. One of them is to do what we call sunsetting the lights. So instead of just taking it from, full blast at 100% light output and then going to zero, we can use our light controllers to gradually dim the lights over maybe the last half hour, kind of simulating, natural daylight and how the sun works. By doing that, you're allowing the conditions in the room to gradually accommodate these changes. The humidity, the temperature, they'll all start changing slowly, and that gives time for the dehumidifiers to actually catch up. And the other thing that you can do is you can program your dehumidifiers to begin removing more moisture. So you can take the set points and you can set them such that they actually are trying to dry out the air more than you really want as you approach lights off, so that is when the lights do go off, you're starting from a drier baseline and there's less moisture in the air. So as it cools, there's less moisture to potentially precipitate out.